And finally, we turn to death. So we're going to talk about death education and then really spend a lot of time defining death and talking about death throughout the lifespan. So the first thing to talk about is, why are we going to study death? Well, it is just not for the morbid, unlike what you might be thinking about it. Typically, when I think of people who are interested in death, I think of the goth kids from South Park, or the vampire people from South Park, or these people, whoever they are. Nonetheless, it's not just for people who seem to have a preoccupation with death. Death is a fundamental aspect of human life. People say that the only two things that are certain in life are death and taxes, and as we know from our politicians, taxes aren't even a certain thing necessarily. But while it's fundamental, we don't really like talking about it. We try as best we can to basically completely avoid it and push off talking about it as long as possible. And even when we do talk about it, we oftentimes talk about it as something that we think that we can try to beat, or would like to attempt to beat. This person says that he thinks that we are currently the first person who will never die is alive. Nonetheless, you get the point. But also, when it comes to Thanksgiving or other holidays, look at news sources for what they say we should be happy about, what we should be grateful about. The vast majority of it has to do with declines in violence, declines in disease, more disease prevention, etc., etc. All of those things are about pushing off death. But it's not really having a conversation about death. Another reason to study it is you are going to be dealing with it either personally or professionally or both. And likely, if you're taking this class, it would be both. Primarily in this class, because we're psychologists, social workers, the therapists of one kind or another who are probably going to be dealing with people who are either themselves in the beginning stages of dealing with death or are going to have a loved one or somebody who they are helping go through the process. And definitely, personally, you are, unfortunately, I hate to break it to you, you are going to die sometime. Everybody you know is going to die. I'm going to die. Everyone I know is going to die. Everybody dies. So it's good to discuss this for these purposes. And we also talk about it in ways that are scary. When we do talk about death in pop culture, it's oftentimes talking about terrorism, mass death, homicide, guns, etc., etc. But we don't really talk about the process of death itself. And we'll talk about this in a minute, but many people actually have problems with defining what death is. And it's also important to know that death education is different from counseling. While you might need to kind of be okay with death, talking about death in order to be educated about it properly, there definitely are two different things. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about facts here, as you can tell from how I have taught this class so far. That's the important thing to me, the science behind it, different than the emotional side to things. So how is death education carried out? Well, the first way is through informal death education. But when we talk about informal death education, it oftentimes is not really thought of as death education. Most people get their first dose of death education in the family somehow. Either if a family member dies, a pet dies, any person dies in your family or in the context of a family. You also can oftentimes deal with it through TV and media, and that can be a way people are exposed. You might not have ever personally known anyone who was shot or shot and killed, but you've probably seen it in the media, and there is informal education that way. In particular, people who are interested in deaf education and the science of it, the study of it, they look to what are called teachable moments. And that would include things like September 11th, auto accidents, mass shootings, etc. And these give times for families and friends and people to all come together and discuss either what it means to have this situation occur, why it occurred, but really, when we talk about it in the context of children, what do children learn? Well, one of the ways that children learn, think about the perspective we would be dealing with oftentimes when talking about death. We're probably not talking, at least for children early on, we're probably not talking about some Piagetian cognitive idea. We'll get to that in a minute. But really, the first thing that they are going to be doing, they're in an extremely ambiguous circumstance. How do you act when this thing has occurred? They look to older people, they look to parents. And so the way that children deal with death oftentimes can be almost mirrored in a social learning perspective from what their parents and loved ones are doing. And that is, despite what you might think, death education. If a older loved one dies and a father or mother, they're crying about it, what message does that send to the children? That it's an appropriate time to cry. And so that is one of the ways that we learn informally. There are also some books out there that deal with death. There's a kind of death education movement as well that wants people, children especially, to be exposed to ideas around death so it's not quite as hard when you are older, and to an attempt to make death more kind of accepted in society, allow people to figure out ways to deal with it a little bit better. These are some books that I've pulled out from my Psychology of Death class in the past. These are all available at the library or through interlibrary loan, depending on where you are. The top left is Tough Boris. That's a story about a pirate who's very tough, and it says Boris is tough. All pirates are tough, and makes these kind of contrasts. And then eventually says, but when Boris's pirate died, he cried. And it's actually kind of touching. It's trying to show that even for tough pirates, it's okay to cry when somebody dies. Bear's Last Journey in the upper right, that is a very sad one. It's about this young fox dealing with the fact that the bear is going to die, and what that means, and how to kind of deal with that at an interpersonal level. In the lower left, The Dead Bird kind of tells you what to expect in it, but two children dealing with that. And then in the bottom right, Finding Grandpa Everywhere. It's a story that this child's grandfather dies, and he is trying to figure out how to deal with it, and he is told by his grandmother and other people that you can find Grandpa in other places. So, for example, Grandpa liked to garden, and you can see him there when you go to garden. You can see him through a hat that he used to like. You can wear the hat, and he'll always be with you. These can be surprisingly touching. There are some less good ways, it's thought, to educate people about death. Books, for example, or just straight out telling children that death is in some level equal to sleep. That's not thought to be particularly good. It can be helpful in the moment because it allows, especially children, to be given something that they can understand. I think, again, realize that death is oftentimes, at least the first time, it's so uniquely different than anything they will have dealt with before. And even in video games, when someone dies, they can be brought back to life, or it doesn't matter. In the media, when people die, they don't really die in the TV shows and stuff like that, a person themselves, and we just move on without having it kind of weigh on us like it will in real life. if I think from a child's perspective, if somebody dies on a TV show and then mom and dad just go, okay, let's make some dinner like nothing happened, then when they have someone die in real life, it can be so much different than what they've been exposed to in the past because they don't know any better. And basically anything that sets up unfair expectations about they will what they will expect. In part because if you think about it, if you tell a child that, oh, grandpa went to sleep, they can and oftentimes will ask, well, when's he coming back? And it can be very difficult to help them, and also very painful for them and you to kind of say, no, grandpa is never coming back. Especially if this is someone who you care about deeply, and you trying to just push again and again to tell the child what's really going on can be really tough for you also. Also, something that seems to be problematic is using, or for pets, is using replacements. If a pet dies, say, oh, we can get another one. What does that tell people about what to do when someone dies or something dies? I remember when I was younger, there was a family at this pool that I managed, and one day a little boy who's 3 or 4 at the time, he just comes up to me and he says, "Gregory, Pinky died." I was like, and then he just jumps in the pool, and I'm sitting there like, what are you talking about? It turned out that a pet died, a pug died unexpectedly, and so the family decided to get another pug and a Great Dane, which seemed to me to be a little overkill, but whatever. But teaching people that we can kind of replace people once they're gone, probably not the best idea. Formal death education is planned death education, oftentimes done through schools, churches, professional organizations. And in the past, it was more focused on death directly, what is happening when someone is dying. But now it is more likely to emphasize kind of the sub focus, so specific kind of tangential aspects to it, such as coping with loss. Grief primarily, where death is the cause, but it's not really what's talked about. It's how to deal with it, how to get past it, and we don't really talk about what death is. Other examples are suicide and suicide prevention efforts that you probably have gone through at some level, crisis counseling, etc. And it really is now that informal death education is the more widespread one that children are exposed to, which is partially why it is so important that we do a relatively decent job. Okay, so let's talk now about what death is, since we've been saying we've been kind of skirting this for a little while. So the first big question is, when is someone dead? So I'd like you just to pause the recording and just think to yourself, what does it mean for someone to be dead? When is someone dead? Okay, so there are a couple different ones we're going to talk about. The first one is functional death. This is what most people think of as death, when the heart stops beating and people stop breathing. However, the people in this situation can be resuscitated, and also be resuscitated depending on how long they've gone without breathing. They can be resuscitated with fairly little damage to themselves. So this is one common way of thinking about death, but it turns out it's actually not the technical definition. For someone to be technically dead in most states, they have to have brain death. And brain death is when there is no brain activity. All of it is gone, as measured by electrical waves. When this occurs, it cannot be reversed. There are a few cases out there. You can Google up people claiming that the loved ones have been brought back from brain death. There's been no case in medical medical history in which someone has been brought back from brain death when there is no error associated with it when people have been mislabeled as being brain dead before and then they are brought back. So some people will talk about, the miracle of this or that, but to medical science's knowledge, there has never been a time when brain cells have been reactivated following brain death. Now, most of the time when people die, this is not actually required. You don't put people, hook them up to an EEG or an MRI in order to see if they are dead. Oftentimes, it's abundantly clear, and most of the time, when there is no heart rate or breathing for a prolonged period of time, you can be pretty sure they are dead. However, to be 100% sure, it is brain death. Now, some people say that the definition of death, or the criterion for death being brain death, is too restrictive. Some people say that losing the ability to think, to feel, to reason, that those things would be sufficient grounds to be called death. So, for example, people with irreversible brain damage, people in comas, they won't have the same experiences. And this is moving from the realm of science, which I like, to the realm of kind of a more moral or philosophical debate. So there is no right or wrong answer necessarily here. You can get intelligent people arguing both sides of it. The most kind of compelling thing to say it's too strict is in the case that we're about to talk about in a minute, but in which people their brain is 99% gone, but there's one little part of it that is left that is still giving off some kind of electrical waves. Their brain is not 100% gone, so they are not technically dead, but what really is left? So another thing for you to think about here is this too strict? Which definition is better? Which way do you think we should go? In particular, should we wait for 100% brain death, or should we wait, or is it okay to say that people who are on the doorstep of death, that they are still alive? An example of this, one of the most famous and contentious examples, is that of Terri Schiavo. I'm just going to read you her part of the, I believe this is actually a Wikipedia entry about her, but it gives a fairly decent overview of what happened. Terri Schiavo collapsed in her St. Petersburg, Florida home in full cardiac arrest on February 25th, 1990. So February 25th, 1990. She suffered massive brain damage due to lack of oxygen, and after 2.5 months in a coma, her diagnosis was changed to vegetative state. For the next few years, doctors attempted speech and physical therapy and other experimental therapy, hoping to return her to a state of awareness. In 1998, Schiavo's husband, Michael, petitioned to remove her feeding tube. He was opposed by Terri's parents, Robert and Mary Schindler, who argued that she was conscious. The court determined that she would not wish to continue life-prolonging measures, and on April 24, 2001, her feeding tube was removed for the first time, only to be reinserted several days later. So, again, this event originally occurred February 25th, 1990, feeding tube getting taken out 2001. On February 25th, 2005, a judge ordered the removal of Terri Schiavo's feeding tube for 4 years after. Several appeals and federal government intervention followed, which included U.S. President George W. Bush returning to D.C. to sign legislation designed to keep her alive. After all attempts at appeals through the federal court system upheld the original decision to remove the feeding tube, the staff at her hospice facility disconnected the feeding tube on March 18th, 2005, and she died on March 31st, 2005. In all, the Schiavo case involved 14 appeals and numerous motions, petitions, and hearings in the Florida court, 5 suits in federal district court, Florida legislation struck down by the Supreme Court of Florida, federal legislation, and 4 attempts to get the Supreme Court to hear the case. Okay, so and no matter what side you're on, should she have had the tube removed or should she not have, we have to agree that this was a mess, right? This is not a situation that anybody would want to see, where someone and their family is going through something like this. For 15 years, there was her original accident in 1990. Then she died in 2005, more than 15 years later. This is not ideal for anyone. And there are a couple things to talk about here. Was she, the first one, the most obvious one, what should have been done? Well, was she dead? Meaningfully, excuse me. It is true that when people could interact with her in a way that would cause her to respond, such as her eyes could blink, her joints could move, but scientifically, it is believed that these were all reflexes. If you guys can remember back to intro psych or biological psychology, if you have had it before, the most animalistic part of our brain, the most basic part of our brain, is the brainstem. That is the thing that even the small animals, the lower animals, have. And the brainstem is where much of our reflexive behaviors come from. So you could have severe damage to the cortex, the outer cortex of your brain, even the middle of your brain, and you could have your brainstem still there. So you could be moving, but it could just be in reflexive ways. There might not actually be any thought, any feeling, anything going on other than reflexes. So is that meaningful enough to take someone out of this kind of a situation? So there's that debate. There's also one of the things, the thing that I hope more than anything else you take away from this is the importance of communicating your wishes to loved ones, and also looking into laws about it. The laws are varying state by state, and you can have situations where even if you tell someone you want something to happen, if it is not done in the proper legal ways, it might not need to be done legally. And these things can be expensive to get done. My family just went through looking at this. My wife and I were talking about it and trying to set up things for my daughters. And we were kind of shocked by all the things that come up. And on top of the issue surrounding death, and whether or not someone should be considered dead in these cases, there's also the question of how your assets are going to be handled. There are some weird ways that they are handled, including that if someone dies, all of the and there's not a direct beneficiary, it can be split up in ways the state has decided just automatically, including someone's estate not being fully passed down to their children, but instead half of it being given to the grandparents or their parents. So it's important. It's really important to do that and to make sure that you talk with your loved ones about what you would want done. This is not a pleasant conversation to have, but it's really, really important. Just think about how terrible it can be, sitting around and trying to figure out what the person you love more than anything else would want done in a situation such as the Schiavo case. Hopefully nobody gets to that, but it is definitely something that can occur. So moving on, let's talk about death today. The first thing I want to point out is the numbers on here are a little old. These come from the text I use in the death class, and they're a couple years old. But also, I should point out that it's not quite as old as you think. It takes a while for the federal government to get all of the statistics from all state and locales. So it's useful enough to go with now. The meaningful information we want to take away from this has not changed since this. So almost 2.5 million people died in the United States in 2007. And that absolute number doesn't matter as much as the kind of rate, and that's about 8 in every 1,000 people. The age-adjusted rate of 7.6, 7.6 out of 1,000 was lower than any point in history, in the history of the United States. And it is thought, although we don't have really good data about this, that we are actually, as I've said this before, we're at the most peaceful time in the history of the world. We're less likely to die now than any time in history. You can also see here that there's this sex and or gender difference where men are more likely to die than women. Men just do dumber things than women do. And all of this points to increasing health outcomes in the United States, that we're getting fewer and fewer people are dying, so people are becoming healthier and healthier, and even if not healthier and healthier, living longer and longer. But it also means that we are experiencing death less today than any point in history for two reasons. The two reasons are, one, people are not dying as much, so we're not as exposed to death. And then also, people are having children at a more spread out rate. So instead of your children being alive when you could potentially have grandparents and great-grandparents around, that people are much kind of more spread out in how children are born. So you right now are probably only exposed to maybe a generation that has grandparents in it. So you actually are less exposed to it because of how spread out the generations are as well. You can also see that in 1900, the rate was 17.2, 1954, 9.2, now down to 7.6. And so this is pointing to the fact that we've had a precipitous decline from 1900 to 1954. But from 1954 to today, it's been slowly leveling off because it's becoming increasingly difficult to keep people alive. While we can get rid of many diseases, or we actually already have got rid of the really bad, terrible ones, relatively speaking, it's harder and harder to do that now. Now we are dealing with much kind of more long-term chronic health issues. To wit, death trajectories have also changed. So death trajectories are basically what your quality of life and amount of time living you have following whatever it is that's gonna kill you. So if you have, let's say you get Alzheimer's, and that is going to be what eventually kills you, that is a relatively slow death trajectory, meaning that you still can have a lot of life left to live even after the onset of it. On the other hand, if there is a terrible car accident, what's going to kill you could be the car accident, and you could die within a split second of getting in the car accident. So that would be a short death trajectory. So death trajectories have changed. It used to be that they were relatively brief. You'd get sick and you would die. Now they're much longer and more protracted because most of the main causes of death are actually degenerative diseases when we take out accidents, which we'll talk about in a minute. So now let's go through death across the lifespan. In each one of the 6 time frames we're going to be talking about, I'm going to talk a little bit about the causes of death and then give you a couple things to think about for each of them. So, infancy. We've talked about causes of death in infancy before. We noted that the United States is currently, last I saw, 35th in infant mortality. The most common causes of death in infancy are are accidents, primarily car crashes, fires, and drowning. And this is awful, but it actually, in a way, is a good thing that these are the highest causes because that means we've taken care of many of the kind of disease causes of death. We're now dealing primarily with accidents. Homicides have tripled since 1900 or 1960, excuse me, to the point that it is now the fourth leading cause of death for children ages 1 through 9. So the fact that they have tripled is terrible. The fact that it's the fourth leading cause of death, I mean, we don't want anything to be the first through third. We don't want anything to be the fourth. We don't want any causes. It's again, in a weird way, it's kind of a good thing that these relatively preventable things are now at the top. It means we've done a good job of taking care of what used to kill us. For parents, the death of an infant can be as dramatic, as tragic, if not more so, than the death of an older loved one. The most common response for parents is depression. Oftentimes because if it is an accident, they can question what they could have done in various circumstances. Now, miscarriage is a little bit different. We actually have a kind of an odd situation with miscarriage that we've also talked about before, where parents form emotional bonds with their child before they are born, especially if they have had ultrasounds or if they felt them kick before. And when the miscarriage occurs, there's a lot of grief when it happens. Especially because it's something that a lot of people don't understand, and the meaning of miscarriage is kind of different depending on where you are in the pregnancy. If you are, you just find out you're pregnant and then have a miscarriage a week or two later, that is, I know this is going to sound harsh on my behalf, from coming from me, but kind of not as bad as if they are, 7 months pregnant. But nonetheless, no matter when it is in the pregnancy, it can be terrible. Death of children can also be as bad in times, and not infants, but children can be as bad in terms of the outcomes as a loss of a spouse or your own parents. In part because it feels unnatural, quote unquote, when that happens, that children don't outlive you. Everybody thinks that their children are going to outlive them, that they're going to live to see all of these great and wonderful events, and kids are just not supposed to die. So this is part of the way it occurs. Children, in terms of their concepts of death, they don't really gain a concept of death until about age 5 or so. They can be aware of death, but they don't really understand it. And they can think of it as temporary, because that's something they can understand, but permanence is something that's very difficult for children to comprehend. Oftentimes they think of it like sleeping, or that people can come back from death. And this is part of the reason I'm saying that informal death education is so important. We should be careful about how we deal with it with children. Other kids can at times be maybe not criticized, but people can look at them like they're peculiar because they might ask a lot of questions about it. They can view death as a curiosity because it's something so different than what they've dealt with before. So you might not have a really morbid kid. You might just have a curious kid, and the situation is so different. They could ask a lot of questions about it. It can also be problematic for children. They oftentimes can say that they feel responsible for death occurring, and they can wonder how they could have prevented it from happening, which is kind of compounded by the fact that they don't have a real decent understanding of kind of the order of the way the world works, what causes what. So that can be difficult for them to deal with. By age 5, they can anthropomorphize death. That's partially why they're scared or something, they just put the pillows over their head or something. They think that if death comes for them, kind of like a death in Harry Potter or something, if something is coming for you, then you can just hide from it and you can escape it. By age 9, they understand that it is universal, and are at that point a little bit more able to understand some of the customs like funerals and cemeteries. If a child is dying, there's been some evidence you'll see from time to time that children can actually show a pretty decent understanding of what they're going through. They can verbalize that they are dying. However, this isn't really seen in studies so much. And we're going to talk about this later, but there are limitations. When a child is dying, it's difficult for researchers to ask permission to talk to them about it. It's not something that many parents would want their kid to be thinking about. But you'll see, on Oprah or something like that, if Oprah still has a show, you'll see a kid on there from time to time who has, terminal cancer, and they will have written a memoir or something. But that's really rare. That's the exception. Adolescents, their thoughts on death are not as advanced as we might think. For the most part, adolescents seem to think that they are invincible, and that's partially why they do such risky things. Um, and it is also the case here that accidents are the most common way of adolescents dying. Frequently, car crashes. Other causes, homicide, suicide, and cancer are the kind of the top ones. But remember, and in adolescence, they have really low rates of death. They don't die as frequently as many people throughout the lifespan do. And because they think that they are invincible, they can have real problems when it does occur, when it does come for them. They can oftentimes get angry and ask, why me? And can be particularly difficult to treat, as in medical treatment, can have a hard time following through with things. In young adulthood, this is another problematic period because death is so far off. They have a whole life to live. The leading causes of death here are also accidents, suicide, homicide, then AIDS and cancer. And it actually switches towards the end of early adulthood where disease moves up to the number one cause. But we'll get to that in a minute. The biggest difficulty here is that you're in a stage of life, and let's think about kind of the Ericksonian stages, where you are planning about things, marriage, careers, etc. And it can cause big problems with relationships. Do you try to have relationships? Do you break up with someone if you're in one? If you get AIDS, can you still have the sexual part of your relationship? These are, and when I say can you, I mean like, will you want to? This is obviously not something that anybody wants to be faced with. So there are also even bigger questions like, should you get married? Should you have children? How do you tell other people? There are no great answers to these questions. And in young adulthood, it's also a problem because they can also be bad patients for the purpose of treatment. In middle adulthood, life-threatening disease takes over as the most common cause of death. But in this point in time, people are aware that they are going to die at some point in time. Around 35, 40-ish, you can say, you're about halfway through life. At some point in time, shortly around there, you will be on average, on the second half of your life. And because of this, death anxiety is often higher in middle adulthood than any other time in the lifespan. They can count how much time they have left. So in middle adulthood, heart attack and stroke is the most common cause of death. And in some ways, people have said this is kind of a good thing, relatively speaking, because it's sudden as opposed to cancer. And there is some debates about whether or not people would prefer to have a sudden death as opposed to a slow, drawn out one. And finally, late adulthood. Most common causes here: cancer, stroke, and heart disease. Interestingly, though, if all cancer, stroke, and heart disease were cured, it's estimated that life expectancy would increase only about 7 years. That has always been something that has been kind of astonishing to me. If you take out cancer, stroke, and heart disease, on average, life expectancy would only increase about 7 years. This is in part because when you are getting older, if you don't die from one thing, it's probably going to be something else. Alzheimer's rates would go up even more if we were to cure cancer, for example. Some people have found that the psychological process involved here might be a bit easier for older adults because they're more used to seeing it. They've seen it in friends and family and spouses, and they're more aware of their own mortality, and so they have had to deal with these thoughts already. And because they've thought about it and dealt with it, they're actually less anxious about death. And this is especially true if they have made preparations for it. If you have your affairs set in order and you can kind of come to terms with how things are going to go following your death, it can seem to be a little bit easier, relatively speaking. In terms of suicide, the rates increase over the course of late adulthood, at least in men. The highest rate of any demographic for suicide is white men over the age of 85. This can be because of depression, dementia. Other people have pointed towards the loss of a spouse. That can be very, understandably, very difficult. But typically, those in late adulthood want to know the exact severity of what is happening medically, and because we have started to tell people more and more, that has helped in some ways and possibly hurt in others. The final aspect of death we're going to cover are the stages of coping with death, made famous by Elisabeth Kubler-Ross. Elisabeth Kubler-Ross was a nurse who interviewed people who were dying, and she came up with 5 stages that she said all people go through in order. And just as a heads up, this is oftentimes talked about as one of the main theories in psychology, talked about with Erikson and the like. However, for reasons we'll see, we are not, obviously haven't talked about it in that way. She was heavily psychoanalytic and came up with these 5 stages because she thought that they were defense mechanisms that people had following the diagnosis that they faced. So she said the first stage was rejection or denial. They denied that death was coming. Basically, they would say things like, I can't have cancer, or I'm fine, there must be a misdiagnosis, or something like that. Then they moved on to anger. So rejection was over, and now people get upset. They would say things like, why is this happening to me? It's unfair. And this anger is particularly big for young people. We talked about that in the last slide in young adulthood, early adulthood. The third stage is bargaining. That's where people bargain with people to try to get through it. They will bargain for more time from God or from doctors or anyone. They might try to get into a clinical trial in some bargaining way. And then depression, 4th stage. This is where people realize they can't bargain their way out of it and instead get sad about it and might ask themselves, what's the point of life? And then 5th is acceptance. This is where people come to terms with their situation. They say that it's okay. And that's about it. These are the 5 stages. And again, this was initially for people who were dying. And it was later expanded to those who were grieving for loved ones as well. But the data that it came from were originally with people who were only dying themselves. So What do we think about this? Well, there were some good things. It got attention on death again. It reoriented it back towards the people who were dying. Many people understand that dying people are going through something, but we have a tendency to push that outside of our mind. However, there are some criticisms to this. Um, and the first one is not so much a criticism as an all-encompassing statement I want to read to you from, this is from the authors of the Psychology of Death book that I use. It is, quote, since the initial appearance of this model in 1969, no independent confirmation of its validity, excuse me, there's been no independent confirmation of its validity or reliability, and Kubler-Ross advanced no further evidence on its behalf before her death. This is pretty damning. You might not be in tune with academic smack talk, but that is about the worst thing anybody could say about your theory, that there's no confirmation independent of yourself, and that there's no other evidence. That is pretty bad. Also, they said many clinicians who work with the dying have found this model to be inadequate, superficial, and misleading. So let's get more specific about some problems. So the first one, we don't know that the stages actually exist. The stages are hard to define and they are broad. So is denial, I'm not ill? Is it, it's not that bad? Is it, I'm sick but not dying? Is it, I'm dying but I'll be a while? We don't know. There's not really good operational definitions for this. 2, we don't have evidence that people go from stage 1 to stage 5 in order. And this is especially the case because we don't know that these stages actually exist, right? So if you don't know they exist, how can we be sure that they go in them in order? And this is true for other stage theories as well, that there's not a whole lot of individuation. We talked about this early in the semester. But even more than saying that children don't go from one level of cognition to the next, this is saying people in a similar kind of mindset are going through something in this order, and that's a little bit harder to take. The third criticism is that it's taken wholesale and its limitations are overlooked. You've probably heard of this before, this stage theory, but never really known what some of the problems were. Fourth, some people don't know if this is a description of the phenomenon or it's a prescription. So is it a description or prescription? A description is just like a photograph where you say this is a picture of a classroom. Whereas a prescription would be if you took a picture of a classroom and you said this is what a classroom should look like. So we don't know if it is a description or a prescription. To that point, the book I use points out that some people have told ill people, you've already been angry, so you should now move on to bargaining, as though this is the way it is supposed to go. And that is not necessarily the case. People could also try to force people's coping styles into this prescribed pattern. Fifth, it takes away from individuality and the totality of a person's life. Meaning that they can't go, we don't know if they're going through these in order, there's no different kind of moderators in here, it says everyone is doing this when this is an incredibly profoundly individualized experience. And then sixth, there's more than just an individual in any coping circumstance. They don't take into account things like resources. Do you think it would be easier to go through the process of dying if you have monetary resources at your disposal? If you know that when you're gone that your children, your family members are going to be okay? That would be a lot easier to deal with, well, relatively easier to deal with, than if you're someone who's really poor and knows that when you die, the sole source of income might be gone from your family. That can be very difficult. So while this stage theory is not good scientifically, it is good in some other ways. The three big contributions are: one, they refocused the discussion back onto the patient as opposed to treating people like they're dogs or something. It gets people to think about what the person who is dying is actually going through. Back in the day, even more so than today, in medical situations, they just do things to you because it was what was good for you. Now it's thought that people should be kind of informed about everything going on. Second thing, it includes the patient in conversations. It gets them to talk about what they want, what they feel. And third, it got people to listen more to those who are dying and allowed them to talk about their experience, allowed them to describe what it is that makes their experience so unique, so meaningful, and allows us to have better insight from people who know what's going on in this the most. So finally, just a couple questions, and you can talk about these on the discussion board. Who should be taught these things at what ages? And then who should teach them? Should it be in school? One of the things I'm kind of afraid of is kind of like with sex ed. If we push everything off on the school, then nobody is happy with how it's done. What should we cover? And where should it be taught? Just some basic questions for you to think about now that you have a little bit better understanding of the psychology behind this.